Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second Spotlight Series event of the year, Keeping Accountability on the Table, Mapping Land Grab and Next. My name is Bianca Castellanos, and I'm the Director of the Institute for Advanced Study. For those of you online, I share that I am a brown-skinned woman with dark hair wearing glasses with black frames. The University of Minnesota Spotlight Series is a collaborative partnership of the Institute for Advanced Study, the University Honors Program, and Northrop to present lectures, panel discussions, exhibits, and other events throughout the academic year around timely topics of interest. The six-part 2022-23 series focuses on how data, their collection, analysis, and the research questions that rely on them connect to the deeply personal lived experiences of individual human beings and to the human condition at large. And I'd just like to note for students who will be joining us for dinner afterward, please come down and join us here at the stage after the event. Thank you. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking from the ancestral and contemporary lands of the Dakota people. But since land acknowledgements are just a beginning for respectfully recognizing Dakota people's history on this land and their sovereignty, the IAS is actively revising our statement to concretely outline our commitment to working with tribal nations, to affirm tribal sovereignty, reckon with this painful past, and counter historical and contemporary injustices. The IAS is also committed to denouncing state-sponsored violence and racism. We stand in solidarity with the families and loved ones of Daunte Wright, George Floyd, Jamar Clark, and Philando Castile, who were killed by police violence here in Minnesota. We are committed to working alongside our relatives to dismantle the systems that seek to do harm, to sharing power, and to building a just university together. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's guest. Margaret Pearce is a Citizen Potawatomi tribal member and cartographer living in Penobscot homelands in Maine. She sees cartography as a form of writing whose secrets and possibilities she devotes her life to learning. She recently collaborated with Ho-Chunk Nation and Miami Tribe to map their removals for the Field Museum, and with the Land Grab University's team at High Country News to map Land Grant University moral parcel responsibilities, for which they received a George Polk Award, among others. She holds a PhD in geography and was a geography professor for 15 years, teaching courses in cartographic history, theory, and practice. Please join me in welcoming Margaret Pearce. For those as excited as I am to have Margaret with us, please also consider joining us tomorrow morning back here in the Best Buy Theater and online for the annual Thinking Spatially Symposium. Margaret will be joined by Dakota land map artist Marlena Miles, as well as Ann Garagiola and Adriana Goodwin of the Truth Project, and Kyle Maloney, co-creator of the Truth Project Story Map for additional presentations and conversation. And furthermore, before we get into the program, I'd like to just offer a few technical instructions for our audience members because this is a hybrid event. We do have a captioner working with us today. We recommend that online attendees view captions by clicking the stream text link shared via the chat. We will also be using Slido to facilitate our audience Q&A today. You can submit questions anytime during our program. Attendees can use their smartphones and either scan the QR code displayed on screen or go to www.slido.com and enter the code Spotlight Series. Please note that questions can be submitted anonymously and do have a 160-character limit. We encourage you to upvote previously submitted questions to ensure we address questions based on audience priorities. Lastly, while our main program will be recorded today, our Q&A will not. And now, without further delay, our moderator for today for the Spotlight Series is Michael Corey. Mike is a Geospatial Technical and Data Lead Associate Director for Mapping Prejudice, which uses crowdsourcing to identify racially restrictive housing covenants on properties in Minnesota and beyond. And it's a terrific site. Before transitioning to public history, he spent 20 years as a data journalist, including at the Star Tribune and the Center for Investigative Reporting. Mike is also currently a graduate student in the University of Minnesota's Heritage Studies and Public History program. Thanks, Mike. Take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, Bianette, and thank you everyone for being here. I know for reference for people online, I am a white man with spiky hair and a suit jacket, and I also know that no one is here to hear me talk, but I'm going to talk for a couple minutes. I know many of you are very familiar with Margaret's work and are as excited as I am to be here with Margaret and to be and I'm very honored to be in conversation with Margaret. But I want to take just a second to get us all on the same page about what we're talking about when we're talking about land grab U. So do we have my slides real quick? We're having fun with tech stuff today, so we'll see how it goes. Well, I will start, and we'll see if we get slides up in a minute. So the main focus of the Land Grab U project and site is looking at the history of the Morrill Act. The Morrill Act is an act passed by Congress in 1862, and what the Morrill Act did is it took about 10.7 million acres of native land and granted it to individual states. And that allowed universities and other institutions to take those lands and then sell them on and make large amounts of money off of the profits. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. And nationally, what we're talking about in terms of 2020 dollars is almost $500 million just in those initial sales of land. Next slide, please. And a key thing is that a lot of these native lands were an excuse that's been made a lot of the times for these is that a lot of these lands were ceded by treaties, and as I think everyone here is familiar, just because there's a treaty doesn't mean that it was a just treaty or that was a fair treaty. But in the case of the Morrill Act, 73% of the lands we're talking about were by a treaty, 23% from an unratified treaty, and 4% just immediate seizure. And all of these visuals so far have been from the Land Grab University's project. Next slide, please. And so I alluded to this a little bit, but so the way this works is Congress gives land to each state. The state government then passes those on to institutions like universities for them to sell on. Next slide, please. And in western states, further west than here, often the universities in those states would get money from parcels directly in their state. In eastern states, and so for example in Minnesota, it's not just universities in Minnesota that are making money off this land. Minnesota is at a really key part of the history of the Morrill Act, and so it's not University of Minnesota gets a lot of money out of these land sales, but also lots of eastern universities, all of your favorites, Harvard, Ivy League schools are all making large amounts of money off of this native land in Minnesota. Next slide, please. And what's really, well, there's lots of crazy things about this history, but not all of these parcels are even sold. There are still parcels that are owned by universities and state governments directly from this land seizure that are still held by colonial institutions today. Next slide, please. So for example, in Minnesota, you can see all of these individual parcels from Margaret's awesome cartography here. All of at one end of the raise, we have the parcels of land that are seized, and then that's all money that's going directly into the University of Minnesota. And at the University of Minnesota, that's roughly equivalent to $18.7 million in inflation-adjusted dollars, and these figures are now from the Truth Project. Oh, sorry, next slide, I forgot to say. So we're talking at the University of Minnesota, $18.7 million in inflation-adjusted dollars. And that's just for the immediate sale of those lands. The money from those sales then goes into the endowment, and then investment income is made off of that as well. Next slide, please. And you can see here some of the other institutions, although it's kind of small for people in the room. University of Minnesota gets a lot of money out of these, but also all these additional universities throughout the country make a lot of money off of lands in Minnesota-Makoche. Next slide. And so what's on these lands today? These are photos by Kaylin Goodluck from the High Country News investigation. Some of it is very rural areas. Next slide. Some of it is developed for residential use. Next slide again. Some of it's in the middle of a city. Next slide. And some of it is walled off and is not for anybody's use necessarily. One more slide. And another thing there's a lot of things I love about the High Country News Project and land grab universities, but one of the coolest things is that you can go and grab all this data for yourself from the GitHub page and do your own analysis of what might have taken place specifically in your area, or if you want to visualize these in other ways. So people can download that information and see for themselves. And one more, please. And as Bianette was saying earlier, there's an event tomorrow with some of the representatives and organizations of the Truth Project. The Truth Project is this task force that comes out of revelations brought out by Land Grab You, and also it wasn't the first time people knew about this for sure. And the Truth Project has been engaged in a process with the University of Minnesota, trying to both understand this history better and then make demands of what the university should do about that. And again, I encourage everyone to come tomorrow and hear more about that work. So I'm going to stop there, and because I know you want to hear from Margaret, so I'm going to pass it over to you, Margaret, and to talk more about the mapping. Thank you.
Is it possible to use a clicker instead of asking next slide, please?
It sounds like not.
Oh, okay. Okay. One moment. We went through a few iterations before we got to this one. Can you, or did you already? I just want to put it in full screen.
Okay.
Here we go.
Oh, you got it.
Bonjour, Jayak. Ha. Bonjour. Greetings. Makosakoyan Dejnakas, Bodwe Wadmin Dao, Makoan Dodam, Gasko Sago and Dochpia, Mina Gadawam Gagan Data. I'm Margaret Pearce. I'm Citizen Potawatomi. I grew up on Seneca territory at Gasko Sago, at the waterfall, Rochester, New York, and I now live at Kadawamkeg, the great landing place, Rockland, Maine. I'm grateful to be a guest here at Minnesota Makoche on Dakota Homelands, and I'm grateful also to my awesome hosts here, Abby and Skylar and Mike and Bianette and everyone at IAS and American Indian Studies for making me feel so welcome. It's also a pleasure to be here in a town where there's so many great mapping projects underway, including but not limited to the Mapping Prejudice project, which we get to talk about a little after the talk. The Truth Project collaboration, of course, Marlena Miles, as was already mentioned, whom we get to sit with tomorrow. The embodied VR maps of outrigger canoe voyaging by Vicente Diaz and his team here at UMN, and everyone activating the resurgence of that other incredible indigenous traditional cartographic form place names at Bude Makaska and elsewhere. As an outsider learning about the hard work behind the Mapping Prejudice project and the Truth Project, it's exciting for me to learn about how each collaboration continues to investigate the stories they know are waiting to be told. And I can see that both projects have a new challenge now to continue to be heard while they continue to work, and to keep accountability on the table, an invitation and an expectation, which begs the question of how mapping may be part of or central to that work of being heard, the work of inspiring the university and other community members to pick up responsibility for what they hear and learn. So with the hope of being useful, I offer some reflections about how accountability has manifested in my own work, specifically in terms of form and composition, which we don't always get to talk about, with the hope it may be relevant. The caveat is, I don't think of cartography as information display. As Bianette mentioned, I practice cartography as language, like writing and speech, with its own vocabularies, grammars, and cultural conventions, whose meanings are co-constructed with readers, listeners, and society. Also, I work in print, so the examples I have are not quite in the same ballpark as many of the projects here, but there are resonances for sure. So I'll jump right in where Mike left off with the land grab project. I came on board this project in 2019 with Tristan Atone and Bobby Lee when they invited me to collaborate as the cartographer on their story about the Morrill Act for High Country News. Bobby had been building a geodatabase of the parcels, first working from digital data and then filling the gaps through painstaking research and manual edits. Now it was our job to turn it into journalism in collaboration with Kaylin Goodluck, Jeff McGee, and Cody Leff. The intention was to present the data in so many dimensions that the narrative could be neither shelved nor forgotten, to approach the story from multiple angles with multiple entry points for different kinds of audiences, so that no matter your preference for how a story about data is told, through writing, next slide, through photo, next slide, online interactive, next slide, or open, next slide please, or open data, or cartography, next slide please. There's no way to emerge from a reading without awareness of how you are individually or institutionally a part of it. That structure of multiple ways in for different kinds of people is part of that strategy for building accountability. Next slide, please. In each of these routes in, we're naming institutions, and the maps are a place to specify what those responsibilities look like, who you're responsible to, and where are they. They specify relationship. Next slide, please. That tone of accountability, we hope, is also built into the print layout. The maps aren't figures, as in see figure 1. They're part of a whole narrative we made together in words, photographs, and graphics. The photography picks up where the words leave off, the maps expand outward in scale from the photographs, and the website moves all of that online and then points to the open data. The maps and photographs, to me, are moments in that narrative to get away from the forward motion of the writing, their drift. By giving readers that drift space, they can absorb what they're hearing and imagine it for themselves. Imagination, so essential to belonging, belonging so essential to responsibility, and what it is to live fully as a human. It's a convention to see photos in this role, but not so often maps. Next slide, please. In the maps for this project, I see a particular type of map. Next slide, please. A particular type of drift. They underline statements from the writing by restating the numbers out loud. For example, and I can't see it here, so I'm just going to come up here. The Morrill Act gave 79,461 parcels of Indigenous lands, totaling about 10,700,000 acres, to 52 land-grant universities to fund their endowments. It's so many numbers throughout, and so they're right there underlined in the titles. Or by representing graphically what has already been stated, for example, a sense of the distances between the Morrill parcels and their beneficiary universities. I point out a few stories, but I'm hoping your attention will wander to those other silent places in the map. I want you to learn something, but I also want you to wonder and imagine learning more. Next slide. The graph also I want to draw your attention to because it's designed in a particular way that in particular people working in Indigenous data sovereignty have commented about in the media, the way that Indigenous data is portrayed in what Maggie Walter calls deficit discourse. So for example, I'm not portraying lands lost here. The lands were not misplaced. That phrase, lands lost, includes neither actor nor mechanism for the theft. Instead, I focus on the United States as the actors and LGUs as beneficiaries. I portray how much was cumulatively taken and when those lands were then cumulatively gifted to the LGUs. Next slide. In the years since the first article was published, land-grab universities has spurred dialogue and inquiry at many LGUs, and the story has received great media coverage. It's made its way onto course syllabi and departmental land acknowledgements and launched new, more detailed investigations relevant to individual institutions at Harvard, Ohio State, Connecticut, and here at UMN. But there have been no scholarships for out-of-state Indigenous students whose lands created those endowments, no development of campus support infrastructure for Indigenous students, faculty, and staff for retention, no land back initiatives for present-day moral parcels, even the very smallest ones. Next slide. So often, practitioners of GIS, data visualization, and cartography speak to the power of maps to serve as agents of change. And the mapping tech industry reinforces that belief by emphasizing the ways maps can empower people for good. When people see the geographical facts about hunger, pollution, housing, or traffic stops, they'll be motivated to act. The software company offers a one map solution or a dashboard, as though grassroots empowerment was simply a matter of loading different variables into a system. Buy our products, use our templates, and change the world. Is it true? What makes a person really listen and unable to forget? What makes an institution feel obligated and willing to suffer the awkwardness of picking up those obligations in unfamiliar territory? Next slide, please. In his 2020 book, Hungry Listening, thank you, University of Minnesota Press, Dylan Robinson asked this question. He draws on the scholarship of Eve Tuck, who rejects the belief that presenting the facts of injustice leads to change. It's a theory that assumes people didn't know about the injustices before, and now that they do, they'll work for change. Maybe, but maybe not. So then what is it? For Robinson, it's the structures of those dialogues and venues for sharing that need our attention. He points to that word inclusion as it was used in Canada's TRC process, as in the featuring of, quote, inclusionary music at a TRC event. But of course, inclusionary depends on fit to settler values, venues, and protocols. The Indigenous content minus the Indigenous structures. In fact, he calls it an apathy towards Indigenous structures. In Hungry Listening, Robinson meditates on what that might look like, in this case, for music performance. Next slide. This book emphasizes the particular importance of diffusing models of dialogue predicated on the settler unidirectionality of knowledge sharing, emphasizing instead those forms that allow both affective experience, whether repulsion or wonder, to emerge and provide sovereign space for Indigenous people to continue to define and enact the work of resurgence. As a cartographer, I'm inspired by Robinson's words and actions. I too want forums allowing both affective experience and sovereign space for defining and enacting Indigenous resurgence. I want it for cartography. Next slide. After Landgrab, I had the opportunity to do a new map project, which was a collaboration about Ho-Chunk and Miamia removal stories for the renovation of the Field Museum's Native North America Hall. Over 100 Indigenous artists contributed to this renovation. Probably some of you have traveled down to it. It opened in May, maybe. For this project about removal, I had the honor to work with Diane Hunter and Scott Shoemaker from Miami Tribe of Oklahoma, Josie Lee and Bill Quackenbush from Ho-Chunk Nation, and Sunshine Thomas Bear and Carolyn Fiskus from Winnebago Tribe of Nebraska. Next slide. My role was to design a map of their stories to fit in this space. For a museum, people visit because they want to learn something fun with their kids on the weekend. My responsibility was to graphically translate Miamia and Ho-Chunk removals in a way that was respectful and memorable. Next slide. So this is how that looks installed. It's 2 9-foot square maps. You can see it in the center there, side by side, forming a space along the wall and floor of about 19 feet. Next slide. And this is that design in profile. I designed it as 2 maps in dialogue to educate people about the diversity of removal circumstances and experiences. It's not one, it's making a space with 2 together. I made them big because I wanted that space, not an explanatory map on the wall that people would survey from behind glass, a space generated by the wall, the floor, and the adjacent airspace, and that people then become part of just by walking near to it. A space large enough that the experience of reading is an embodied experience where Miamia and Ho-Chunk people have decided to tell us a few stories about what happened and where and what is happening now. A space where all text is speech. A space intended to be made whole when visitors enter into it to read or talk or meet one another. Neither map includes a legend because I'm trusting you to learn the visual language as you go. There's no overarching narratives or conclusions and no reading order. Instead, the stories are told in patches situated on and with the land in relationship with that land. It's drift. So when I look at these maps, I see the expectation for and invitation to accountability everywhere. It's what my collaborators were saying when they were telling their stories, and what I was looking for when I was making that composition. So there isn't time to go into them all. I just kept finding more and more. Next slide. So I'm going to focus on the Ho-Chunk map. The title they chose as the portal into their removal stories translates as, "We have been here since the beginning of time." Next slide. The voice that flows out of that title is that of Bill Quackenbush, Manager of Cultural Resources for Ho-Chunk Nation, known to some people in this room. He says, "People don't take the time to listen to learn our real story. They talk about us. They say, oh, Ho-Chunks were nomadic. They'd always go here and there. They say Ho-Chunks didn't have a real home." Next slide. "We were never nomadic," he says. "We've never been. We never wanted to leave. We always wanted to stay. When people didn't want to know the truth, it helped justify our forced removals." Accountability begins with listening and learning, and the persistent failure of the general public to understand the most basic facts about Ho-Chunk people is exactly what perpetuates violence against them. Next slide. Ho-Chunk people were removed 8 times in 40 years. 4 of those removals come through Minneapolis. In 1848, up the river to Long Prairie. In 1849, again to Long Prairie. In 1855, from Long Prairie to Blue Earth. And in 1863, simultaneous to the Dakota genocide, from Blue Earth to Crow Creek. Next slide. In the first removal to Long Prairie, Josie Lee tells the story of their expulsion. Then she ends by calling attention to the ways settlers named the towns on those same lands as though honoring Ho-Chunk leadership. But in fact, she writes, "After we were gone," in the right-hand panel, "white settlers memorialized our genocide by naming towns after us: Winnebago Township, Creek, Decorah, Waukon Junction." Next slide. She then tells us about their leadership traveling down to St. Paul to negotiate a better place to live, and the map follows her there. The map takes us to places you know, asking you to look at what happened there on streets whose names you know. So for example, in that bottom panel, when they get to St. Paul to negotiate a new treaty, in that left-hand bottom panel, many whites in the Minnesota legislatures opposed this new treaty for their own political and economic interests. Use racialized, fear-mongering language to justify their opposition. Next slide. Oh, thank you. Yeah. My collaborators also speak about the white lawyers and white citizens who stepped up for them, as in this example. This is in Wisconsin. In Portage, a crowd of settlers forced the soldiers to release 2 landowning Ho-Chunk families from the boxcars. In Reedsburg, 200 settlers demanded the release of another family of landowners, then physically forced the soldiers to let them go. The story has been told very movingly by Stephen Kantrowitz, his writing. Next slide, please. Eventually, Josie addresses the reader directly, wanting to know the reader's intentions. As she speaks, the map revisits the scenes of stories that the reader has already heard elsewhere in the map, scenes pertinent to her words, first at Crow Creek, South Dakota, then at Blue Earth, Minnesota, then at Reedsburg, Wisconsin. What does this mean for you as the learner of our stories? I understand there isn't really a point to being held accountable for the actions of your ancestors. That's Crow Creek. Next slide. Next slide. I do also believe there are ways of acknowledging the things that have happened and being cognizant of how you benefit from them as an individual. I don't expect apologies, but I do expect changed behavior. That's Blue Earth. So if you see an injustice, or if you can recognize the things that aren't equal across the board, do something. It's up to you as somebody who is more privileged to address it and to make those changes. That's Reedsburg. In his essay, next slide, please. In his essay, Imaginary Spaces of Conciliation and Reconciliation, David Garneau considers the irreconcilability of Indigenous and settler spaces and wonders what that means for art. He concludes, art is not healing in itself, but it can be in relation, sharing in a discourse about histories, responsibility, and transformation among artworks and with other human beings is a corrective to the colonial desire for settlement. Next slide, please. So I have time for one more example about accountability, I think. Next slide. This one involves the NACIS meeting, which is the annual cartographic conference, which is coincidentally or not coincidentally meeting in the city at this very moment. Every year the conference features a map quilt event, which is when different cartographers are each given a square with a location somewhere in the grid of the conference city, and then they give those squares to different cartographers, and each cartographer works on their particular location in the map, and then it's all digitally, not sewing, and then it all comes together as this big reveal at the conference. And in 2020, the host city was Milwaukee, and it was the 40th anniversary of NACIS, so they invited all the past presidents to do a panel, and I, being a past president, was invited to do a panel. This is the quilt that resulted, and you can maybe see that it's mostly the street grid of Milwaukee. There's one that doesn't have the street grid, that's the blocks, and there's one that's the port. But everything else is the street grid except for one, which is black. I'm pretty sure the organizers did not know that Milwaukee is on the homelands of my people, Bodwe-Wamek. In Potawatomi, the name for that place is Menoak. When I got my square from the organizers and looked at its location, I saw that the land included the headwaters of the Kinnickinnic River, which comes down through, horizontally through those panels. Anton Troyer taught me that Kinnickinnic comes from the word Geneginig, meaning something that is mixed, and that meaning references that mixed medicine that we smoke. I saw that the river had been channelized as part of a failed flood protection program, then never restored. I learned that after they were channelized, everyone began dumping their sewage into them, and Geneginig, Medicine River, was now extremely polluted. So for my square, I made a panel. Next slide, please. Next slide. I made a panel for a Yajwangogan, a bandolier bag, black with a border of white beads and red ribbon. I redrew the old headwaters of Geneginig before the channelization using the township survey to trace the creek and wetlands there. I drew the river introducing themselves, Geneginig Ninse, I'm something that is mixed. I included the mounds that are there in relationship, but I repositioned and resized them to protect their locations and to indicate their incommensurability with the map of the city of Milwaukee. Then I added the present day channel and let Genig speak to that violence. So it says, you made me a straight ditch, drained my medicines, drained my spongy confluence, bulldozed conversing earthworks. You called me a sewer, gave me your feces, your metals, paved, moved, and straightened me. I finished the left side with Potawatomi beadwork that is sitting in a drawer in the Field Museum, so I thought I would bring that beadwork home. And then the upper right corner, I typed the Wisconsin DNR summary for the state of the Kinnickinnic River. Year last monitored 2020. General condition poor. Impairments include acute aquatic toxicity, low dissolved oxygen, degraded biological community, PCBs, contaminated fish tissue, E. coli, unspecified metals. Recreational restrictions include pathogens. Pollutants include total phosphorus, fecal coliform, chloride. Outstanding or exceptional? No. Impaired water? Yes. River species? Absent. Next slide. We all bring accountabilities to the table. I've been thinking and learning about how accountability to one relationship may manifest as refusal in another. Cartography helps me to clarify how to make that kind of a shift. It helps me to remember, and then it helps me to resituate. Next slide. Some of you have asked why Minnesota is featured in the land grab article with a map. The reason is because the 1851 cession benefited the most LGUs. And Tristan and Bobby also saw there was a story there in relationship with the Dakota genocide. Next slide. They made many drafts of a longer story, and I made many drafts of a timeline to support that story. The graphic marks the timing of moral parcels, assignments with the events of the Dakota genocide, which we took in the timeline up to the 1865 hangings of Medicine Bottle and Shakpe here at Fort Snelling. But there wasn't time, given our deadline, to report and tell it fully, nor was there enough space in the article's word count. Next slide. And anyway, it's your story to tell. I am so looking forward to listening to what the Truth Project decides to say about these events, or what they decide not to say, and what else they ask and expect us to hear and to pick up. Eo chimigwach. Next slide. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Margaret. Incredible stuff. So I am, again, excited to talk more with you about this. We're gonna do a couple of questions between ourselves, but if you want, you can start submitting questions now. I think a QR code will happen at some point, and you will be able to start posing your questions now, and they'll go into a queue that I will get on my iPad later. So I want to start with one question. We actually just saw a timeline that didn't make it into the final bit of Land Grab U. Were there other things that you tried to map in Land Grab U, or other projects that just didn't work, like in the final draft?
Yeah, so one of the aspects that really limits the project that I'm hoping doctoral people working on their dissertations are working on now or soon is the working with Charles Royce's Indian Land Cessions of the United States, which is from 1896, I think, and it's where we get for this project, got our information regarding treaties and land cessions, and geographers often use it to show the visual display of land cessions through the US. But that book gloms together ratified treaties, unratified treaties, seizures, seizures by the US executive order, seizures that are just seizures, and calls them all land cessions, which is really problematic. And then people show them as land cessions. So that's a huge issue in this project, and it really needs to change. Also, as part of that book, I'm talking to the audience. Also, as part of that book, the names of the tribes who are on the treaties are as they are written on the treaties or whatever the document is, and we really tried really hard to tie everyone to Indigenous nations as they call themselves today, and we spent I don't know how long trying to do that, and like weeks, and we totally didn't have the time. And then finally we realized that it was a whole other project, more gigantic than us, and we scrapped the whole thing. So it's hard to look at that in the project. And just to comment, just to extend it into the removal maps, that we were trying to do too much on those maps for a long time, and especially to represent their homelands before removals, just show people this is what our lands are, and that was so important, and we really tried to do it, and then it was like a whole other exhibit to do that, and I think that has been that was a huge compromise. Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to think of the work. Plus, it was so much work. I mean, it was months work, and then it's not there. I'm sure you have had similar experiences mapping prejudice.
Yes, we have. We were talking about this earlier, and I was trying to think of what do we try to map that didn't work. And I think some of it's very basic. Like we used to draw covenants as red squares on the map, and that led to a lot of confusion with redlining, which is kind of the opposite process. So we have now switched that to green, partly just to avoid confusion with redlining, and also because we really think of covenants now as something to be addressed to the people who live there now, and to get them to understand that, well, the people who lived here at the time financially benefited from these, and you are now financially benefiting if you live in these areas. I think sort of a flip side of that is I think in a lot of ways the maps of covenants have been very successful in getting people to see patterns, but there's a lot of the city that didn't have covenants for one reason or another. And like my neighborhood in St. Paul, Marion Park, Matt Groveland is one of these neighborhoods where there's a bunch of covenants south of there, and there's a bunch of houses by me that don't have covenants. And I think the reaction that I've gotten from neighbors and reactions we've heard from lots of people is, well, whew, we're good. There was no racism here. And literally they'll say yep, it's always been a welcoming neighborhood. I knew it. and I think and so that's been a mapping challenge for us, is to figure out how to communicate about the rest of those spaces. And so we sort of opened up some new fronts on that. One is that if you look at a lot of these neighborhoods, Marion Park is one, Linden Hills in Minneapolis is another one. They didn't have covenants. Part of the reason they didn't have covenants is because they had the KKK and they had white violence, literally pushing people out of these neighborhoods. And in a lot of ways, covenants are your neighborhood, if you don't want black people in your neighborhood, chose option one, which is pushing them out violently, or option two, you can avoid all this unpleasantness by putting in covenants, and it's a way to avoid having to push black people out of your neighborhood. And so that's something that's been a challenge for us to map, and I think is a limitation of the covenant maps themselves. And so I think to the same end, you've addressed some of this already, but what do you think maps are really good at communicating, first of all, and then second of all, where are there possibilities or vocabulary in cartographic language that are still underutilized, that you see a lot of room for growth in?
Yeah, so I really like the way that maps allow drift and rumination, and they let us go on our own time, and we don't have to and it's all present there, and so I feel like it's forgiving for us, I mean, I'm particularly like a slow reader, so I just want time to absorb. And then also, it's then allows so much, like it allows us to put what is incommensurable side by side. Or different time scales together, just like residing together in space. And that just allows so much flexibility in terms of making plural spaces and expressing narratives that don't fit a linear structure or don't want to be in a linear structure. Then I forgot about the.
Well, I'm actually going to add a question on, and because I think what's fascinating about a lot of the maps you showed is that, like you say, they have this ruminative quality. They're not necessarily linear, but I think that like an experience that I've had in doing a lot of mapping for journalism projects is that often the request you get is like, well, we just want to let people explore this data, for example, and I feel like generally that doesn't work. Like people don't necessarily want to explore a sort of neutral map that's got a lot of dots on it, for example. Like that by itself is not really driving home a message. It's not super engaging. You don't get a lot of clicks off of just doing that. So I wonder if you could articulate, like, what do you see as the difference between that ruminative quality and the sort of like more generic notion of explore, if that question makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, ruminative, there's definitely narrative present. And it's about bringing the reader in and giving the reader agency and responsibility to assemble parts of that narrative themselves. And simultaneously not to be explained to. So one of the things that's so, I think we both connected about how annoyed we get with exploring data. I feel like then other people feel that too, and so then they go in the other direction and they're just like explaining at readers or the audience, and then the audience just like runs away.
So the other half of the question is sort of where are there still possibilities or vocabulary in maps that are underutilized that you see?
Yeah, I'm curious about your answer to this too. My pet peeve these days is this persistent neutrality, and by that I don't mean like not taking a side. I mean like passiveness. And so just like that graph I was showing, I'm like, there's no actors. We need to bring humans or relatives in, and there need to be verbs. And we need to understand, how are these things happening and why are they happening? And so there needs to be people present. I feel this when I look at so-called climate change maps, because there are no actors in them. It's just, the permafrost is just thawing. I don't know why, it's just thawing. And that needs to change. And if we thought of maps as language, if we thought of cartography as language, that would immediately tweak us, because we would see that there was parts missing to that sentence, and that there was passive voice that needs to be revised. What about you?
Oh, well, I think those are all great concerns that I would share. I think like one of the challenges of like digital mapping, which I do pretty much exclusively digital online mapping, well, I guess not exclusively, but is that in some ways the barrier to entry is lower than it used to be to make a map, but all of the maps look the same. And I think like, and I put myself in this category as someone who like, I would love to be a cartographer, but I am not a cartographer. Like, I mean, there are a few chances I get to do cartography. But I think like there's a challenge when you want to break out of just putting points on a map or just putting polygons on a map, and you want to tell a story with movement. I think the out of the box tools are still kind of limited with that, and I think like I don't really know where to go to acquire those skills of like doing more. Let's see. I think I just asked this question. So Well, so a related question, I think like one especially challenging concept in some of these maps is that you're trying to bring together incompatible sets of geographic understandings between colonial knowledge and native knowledge. I wonder if you have thoughts on how that factors into, for example, like how do you explore having a base map that either embraces both of those worlds or chooses between them or toggles between them? So more generally, how do you think about the concept of a base map?
I don't. I am anti-base map. And I feel like I didn't used to have to speak to base maps, but I feel like they come up a lot now. I think I blame tech. I blame those corporations because now they're like, choose a base map. You have these 5. And that's not the way I learned cartography. You know, we made all the pieces. And so I still do that in my work. Of course, I don't know. And it's weird to me that that's changing, but I, of course, am building all the pieces because the structure is not apart from, there's nothing is apart from the map, in the map. It's all one, and it's all one graphic composition. And that structure that you make for one map is not going to fit the structure of another map. Even if you're doing a series of 5, they're going to have a particular structure that fits those 5, and that's only for that. And otherwise, if we think of it as a base map, it's so problematic because then it's like mapping is arranging stuff on a surface, which is not what it is. So it's terrible design. It's terrible for plurality of ontologies. You know, they're choosing one to be the base, whatever that is, and then the other one is somewhere lost on top of that base. So that's a problem. And then you're also, somebody is at the bottom and somebody is like somebody is buried, and that's unacceptable. So, yeah. I recently had the bizarre experience of someone, when I was working on the removal maps, came to my studio. I had this beautiful place to work at Art OMI, and they're looking, they're like, that's really cool. Where did you get the map? And I was like, what? And I just realized suddenly like how people who don't make maps are beginning to see maps as consumer objects, and then we style them somehow to tell stories rather than, and that's just as odd as saying, which sentence would you like to begin with? And then you can just like add some adjectives to that.
I like that. I would just say we're actually ahead of schedule, so I'll ask 1 or 2 more questions, then we can transition to audience. That is not an outcome I foresaw, but so I think to that same question, like a thing that we have heard recently that I was surprised to hear, and I'm curious if you have heard this, is well, no one knows how to read maps anymore. Maps are dumb. Nobody likes maps anymore. Which, as a project called Mapping Prejudice, that would be an issue for us. But I'm curious if you've heard anything like that the kids these days don't like maps. Yeah.
Kids these days.
The blue jeans, and they're not liking maps. But.
You mean like any kind of map?
Well, your guess is as good as mine, to be honest. We were very perplexed to hear this.
So often, I have had the experience in the past of people saying to me, you make maps? My husband loves maps. But people don't say that as much anymore. People often say to me, I love maps. I don't get that gendered answer as much anymore. But people do say a lot, I'm terrible with maps. If I didn't have my GPS, I would be lost. And yeah, that just makes me just want to like tell them, all the ways that if they just turn the GPS off for a moment, because sense of direction and maps and loving maps, they're not the same thing. I have a terrible sense of direction, and I love to make maps. And yeah, they're just, I have both those qualities. Do you hear that, since you are closer to the kids these days than me?
Well, mostly we have decided to not follow this advice. I'll say because I think the experience of the project has been that people do in fact love maps. They respond well to maps, but I think in the vein of accountability, the maps do one set of work, but I think like we don't really think the map is the work. And as my boss Kirsten will, I'm gonna get my bonus now. As my boss Kirsten would say, our process is our product, and really, where we think some of the really key change that happens in people's understanding of this is actually in the transcribing of the deeds themselves, and the process of making the map, where people are confronted with primary source documents that are there's no ambiguity about how racist they are or where they are. They're in your neighborhood.
Can I make a comment about that?
Yeah.
It's in a way, do you feel like you're giving them the experience of mapping? Because when we're mapping, we're getting that really profound experience of the place.
Right. I think they're getting to build the map. They're getting to participate in something. They feel like they're doing something. I mean, after George Floyd was murdered, our transcription sessions just exploded. I mean, people just wanted to do something. And it felt like they were contributing to something positive. And also, especially as COVID happened and those moved to Zoom, people on those sessions are also able to, while they're transcribing, they start having conversations with each other about, oh, I didn't know this, or I did know this, and sharing knowledge. And again, like that's, so the maps do the work of saying, there's more than we thought, here's where they were, and like letting researchers do more work on those. But really people don't really get it until they're up close and personal with those original documents, I think.
It's like what people say about translation, like word translation. Like if you engage people in translating language, like written words, language, then their understanding and awareness changes.